welcome back to my channel. This is Chicky Bean Loves Books. I am Jenna, and this is my April wrap-up. I read a lot of books in April, and so many of them I loved. If you've never been here for one of my wrap-ups before, this year I started doing something different with them. I started pulling a random question from my teacup that I got at the Jane Austen Museum in Bath, England. I did not get the questions there, but I started pulling question to accompany each fiction book that I read. I do have quite a few nonfiction that I want to go over with you, as well as some honorable mention books. So first I'm going to say that I have 2 books from my TBR that I am well into, that I will finish, but probably not before May hits. And so I'm going to continue reading them, but I'll include them in my May wrap up. That is Molly Peacock, The Paper Garden. An artist begins her life work at 72. Loving this book. So wonderful. I will have many great things to say about it. And then I'm also in the midst of reading A Precious Daughter by Diane Allen. Those are 2 that I'm rolling over into May, and I'll finish them pretty early on. Then I also have these books that I read for my master's degree, Between the World and Me. This was not my first read of this book, but it was a reread. Going to Meet the Man, Stories by James Baldwin. The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. Dreaming in Cuban by Christina Garcia. Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. The Yellow Birds by Kevin Powers. Then I also have some nonfiction books and a series of short stories that I will not be answering a question about, but that I did read. So first I have House Lessons, which I listened to on audio from my library. Really, really delightful. It takes place on an island that is very close to where I live. I loved the locale. I loved the story about restoration of houses and families and people. I just really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. Then I read Museum of Souvenirs. I'll put the book cover up here. I listened to this one as well. This was for my In Real Life book group. This was a series of short stories by the author of Bowlaway, if you have read that novel. These were okay. I did not love them. We just had our book group discussion last night, and everybody loved them, and I was like, nah, they just weren't for me. Then I also read The Lady in the Cellar by Sinclair McKay. I just finished this last night, and I really enjoyed this. This is the kind of nonfiction true crime that I love. It's a Victorian era true crime nonfiction investigation. The tagline, or the smaller line here, the subtitle is Murder, Scandal, and Insanity in Victorian Bloomsbury. Yeah, you had me at hello. So I really enjoyed this. I won't give much away because I want those of you who are interested in it to have the same kind of fun and surprise as I was able to have. But it's basically about a boarding house run by a German family or couple in Victorian England in the 1870s. It is a respectable place in Bloomsbury. A almost completely decomposed woman's body is found in the coal cellar. How did she get there? How long has she been there? Who put her there? Was it foul play? Did she crawl in? Did she get delivered with the coal? What happened? Who was she? We find out pretty early on who she was, but what happened? Fascinating. Loved it. Highly recommend. I read The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. This is a backlist title that I read for the American Library Association Recommends pick of the month. It was very scary to read about how close we have been to nuclear war, to think about hindsight, and to think about what's going on in the world today. So I can't say that I enjoyed this, but I appreciated it. Yeah, I definitely appreciated it. It's very well written. It's very engaging, and it moves very quickly. He's a great writer, and he knows a lot of information. A Life of Her Own by Emily Carley, I think you say. This was so interesting. This is the story of the memoir of a girl from the French Alps who lives through World War I and II. She becomes a teacher. She fights for women's rights. She's just force to be reckoned with. It is such a fascinating account of a slice of life, time and moment in a place that I don't think has changed a whole lot from when she lived there and then when she wrote this. I highly recommend this. It is not something you can plow through very quickly. It took me probably about 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks to read it, which is very slow for me, but I savored every moment because it really puts you in that time and place. Beautiful, wonderful book. This is a treasure. I'm glad I have this. Speaking of treasures, this should be one of Australia's national treasures. This is 10 Steps to Nanette by Hannah Gadsby. I loved this memoir. It is so sad and so funny and so insightful, and I just highly recommend this. I want to put this in the hands of almost everybody I know. I strongly suggest you grab this. In the meantime, watch Nanette and Douglas, her 2 stand-up specials, although to call them stand-up is a shadow of what they are. But I highly recommend you watch those. They are on Netflix. Then I read The Hiding Place. This was my first read of The Hiding Place, although I know the story very well. And I read it in this special edition, which comes with lots of pictures and special pages with quotes and things like that. And this was an experience. This was just, I spent Easter reading this and in one day, in one sitting, and it was so hopeful. And if you're not aware, Hiding Place is it's the memoir of Corrie ten Boom, but she's writing with help of other authors. And it is her memoir of her time before not before World War II, but before being caught and placed in a work camp. She and her father and her sister hide, save, and evacuate thousands of Jews in their watch shop, above the apartment above their watch shop. So it talks about what life was like before they started doing that, what life was like while they were doing that, and what life was like after they got caught, and then what life was like when they survived. Again, it's incredibly hopeful, and it's not about like a hopeful time, and yet her faith and her hope and her bravery, her courage, and just her spirit just shine through. Knowing this story as well as I did, I didn't know how I'd feel about reading it, but I knew that I wanted to, and I'm really glad that I did. All right, so those are all of the books that are honorable mentions. That's all the newsy stuff, and the nonfiction reads. I had a lot of nonfiction reads this month, which is pretty good for me. Now I have 21 books to answer a question about. So let's dive into those. I'm going to do the 3 that I don't have physical copies of first. So first I'm going to do Passport, which I guess technically is a nonfiction. So actually, let me just talk about Passport, and I won't do a question for Passport. Passport is a memoir. It's a graphic novel, and I read it during 2 special weeks at school. I'm a teacher, and we had 2 weeks of kind of cross-division learning. It was, suspended to the actual classes that normally people are in, and students got to self-select topics of interest for a deep dive, and I was part of a threesome of teachers who were working to create a reading experience for our students where they could think about diversity in publishing, or lack thereof, diversity in bookshops and displays, cover art, things like that. But about 3 or 4 hours a day for 2 weeks, we got to just read, teachers included. Part of the joy of that was having students say, hey, read this. So I read Passport on a student recommendation and really loved it. It is a graphic novel about a girl whose parents are spies. I mean, it gets more specific than that. It tells you exactly what they do, but for all intents and purposes in this video, I'll just say spies. But she doesn't really understand that as she's growing up. She just knows that she moves all the time. She can't keep her friends. She can't tell her friends where she's going or when she's leaving them. And she hasn't been in the States for most of her life. She is growing up though, and she's starting to rebel, and she's rebelling even more because she doesn't understand what's going on. There are limitations and expectations put upon her which don't make any sense to her because she has no context for them. And so it's her experience of coming to this realization of what her parents do and how that has impacted her life. So it was, I think it was a pretty unique story, and it was really well told. And my students were really into it. They really loved it. So I read that one. And then I read this one on a student recommendation, Magic Fish. This is another graphic novel, and I will answer this question about it, which I actually pulled for Passport but didn't use. So this is, were there any quotes or passages that stood out to you and why? So I don't have it with me, and I read it 3 weeks ago, and it wasn't mine, so I didn't annotate it or anything. But I think what stands out to me the most about Magic Fish is the connection to fairy tales. It's telling a very real story about I believe Vietnamese, but I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me on that. An Asian boy who is dealing with gender, gender identification, trying to figure out who they want to be, who they are. How does that fit within their culture and their family? And it's really beautifully well done. I'm so tired, people. Forgive me, cut me some slack for this particular wrap-up video. But what I'm trying to say is that the way that the story is told and connected to fairy tales is really profound and very beautiful. I do highly recommend this. The artwork, fantastic. And many students asked me to read this book. So know that it is something that they are drawn to and that they understand. And so, highly recommend this. And that is that. And the last book that I don't have a physical copy for is Measure for Measure. I do actually have a physical copy of this, but it's my gigantic Royal Shakespeare Company bind up of all of Shakespeare, and I don't want to pull it off my shelf. Having pulled it off my shelf to read Measure for Measure and then tucked it back in there, I'm not pulling it off again. Let's just answer this question. What did you learn from this book? Okay, so Measure for Measure is one of my favorite Shakespeare's. It is another one of those problem comedies or problem plays. It could be a comedy, but it is also quite tragic. And so scholars don't really know where to place it, how to categorize it. And a lot of the comedies that my group has been reading so far this year have been these problem plays. This is another one of those problem plays. I do not consider it a comedy, but I didn't gripe about having to read it because it is one of my very favorite Shakespeare plays. Basically, you have the same things that women are going through today. You have a nun. This is what I learned. I learned that things don't change as quickly as they should. In this play, you have a nun whose brother is about to be killed because he's broken a new law. He has slept with his fiancée before they were married, and she has become pregnant, and that's against the law now. And so he's been thrown in prison, and the penalty is death. And so he is going to die, and you have a nun, and who is his sister, and she's going to everyone that she can possibly appeal to save his life. One of the people who has the power to save him, she appeals to, and he's attracted to her, and he hates her because he's attracted to her, and he tries to rape her. Who knows what Shakespeare actually intended for that, but most productions keep it at tries. And then all of this is early on in the play, and then the play switches. I mean, there is some silly stuff, like the governor, having put these new laws into place, wants to know how his people that he rules and governs are responding to them, what life is really like as a commoner. And so he pretends to be somebody else that puts him in a like first-hand witness situation for a lot of crazy things, to see how his rule affects the average person. And so there's a lot of farcical stuff that happens with that. And then there's a huge, gigantic, wild twist in the end of this play. When you think it's over, it's not over. And then you think, oh, now it's over, and it's not over. And what I learned is that things don't change as fast as they should change. Many of the things that are really, really rotten about the world today were rotten about the world 200 years ago. Highly recommend Measure for Measure if you have not yet read it. Then we are done with all of the books that I don't have physical copies of, and we move on to the books that I do have physical copies of. So I have a stack over here, and I'm just gonna randomly take them, and they're in no particular order. The first book that I've just pulled off my stack is Rosie Walsh's The Love of My Life. I read this because it was a pre-order that arrived in March, which meant I was reading it in April. So let's pull a question. What happens or should happen after the ending? Oh dear. I'm gonna fold this one up and put it back and pick a different one, because if I talk about that, I will completely ruin this twisty, turny, thrillerish ending. So I'm not even going to go near that one. So I've refolded this, put it back in my jar, and picked a different one. Okay, I can do this one. So what scene resonated with you most on a personal level? Why? How did it make you feel? I don't know that anything in this book resonated with me on a personal level. The basic premise is that there is a woman, and she is not who she says she is. Her husband and her child do not know who she actually is, and there are reasons for that. She has a past, and she's hiding things. What is she hiding? Why is she hiding? Is it a love affair? Is it something more sinister? Has she stolen someone else's identity? Why? All sorts of things going into this. There's one scene where, and I will not be spoilery here, but there's one scene where a woman, I'm trying to do it without ruining anything. A woman is watching a child who she knows very well, but the child doesn't know her. And the child sees her and is very curious, just in general, and follows her. And the way that it depicts for the reader how much she simultaneously wants this child to follow her and is terrified of this child following her is so intense. Yeah, this was a great reading experience for me. The Love of My Life by Rosie Walsh. Another pre-order that arrived that I read the following month, which is For Aunties and a Wedding. This is the sequel to Dial A for Aunties. I know that these are ridiculous, but I just get so much joy, silly, giggly, laugh out loud joy from reading them. So in this one, our protagonist is getting married. We met her and her fiance and her aunties in the first book, and they're getting married. His family is from London, and so she needs to hire a wedding planner who can travel with her. And so she ends up hiring somebody who ends up being part of the mob. She hires the mob to plan her wedding, and they're in London, and things go awry in the most hilarious of ways. This is what you can expect from this book, like hilarity and absolutely ridiculous situations that would never happen in real life. Never would these situations happen in real life. But it's just so much fun to read them. So I am going to pick a question. It's really long. I hope it's not like a highbrow question, because this is not highbrow literature, but let's see. Woo! It's so long. What on earth does this say? How about the part of the novel not essential to the plot? All novels may bring with them the demands of plot and story, but they also talk about many other things as well on the way. Since authors often tell stories to make arguments, which means that how the stories are told matters as much or more than what stories are told, it is often in the parts of the novel not essential to the plot that novels argue most stringently. With these issues in mind, what happens in this novel besides the plot? How and why do these things happen in the ways that they do? So one of the things that happens in this novel besides the plot is that Medlin, is that her name? Medlin? Meddy, we'll call her Meddy, learns to separate from her aunties, her identity from her aunties, and to embrace the husband who she loves but hasn't ever had to rely on like she has had to rely on her aunties for her whole life. So that is a part of the story that is not actually central to the plot, that definitely develops. These are also really heartfelt. They are not just silly. They are also family dramas, kind of. So if you're not reading these, I really think you should give them a try. Major Pettigrew's Last Stand by Helen Simonson. I read this for the prompt from the Read Harder Challenge, to read a romance with a protagonist, or where at least one of the protagonists was over the age of 40. So this is the question that I will answer. This is a beautiful book that's it's savory, it unfolds very slowly. But Major Pettigrew is a tight-laced, typical, if there's any such thing, British man who kind of holds to the old ways, the old ideals of propriety and honor, expectation. He loses his brother dies, and this kind of facilitates his chance. He's not waiting for it, but it facilitates a chance to build a friendship with a local Pakistani woman who runs a shop, and they slowly fall in love, basically. But there's all sorts of cultural expectations put upon both of them for who they can love, how they can express that love, what role family plays in two individuals' relationship. It gets really intense near the end, in such good ways. Yeah, I don't think I've read a book exactly like this before. It gave me some Jane Austen vibes, but it was also a little bit like a thriller. It was fun, and also thought-provoking. So let's see what the question is. Oh, this is the one that I put back for the love of my life. So this is what happens or should happen after the ending. Well, to put it quite simply, they should live happily ever after. Next, let's talk about the Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. This was another one of those pre-orders that came in March that I needed to read in April. Or actually, it might have come in April and I read it in April. I don't know. I don't remember. But I loved this book. This is about a podcaster, a true crime podcaster, blogger, who has some secrets of their own, who finds one of the main topics of their blog or their vlog or their podcast, whatever it is they do, arrive in her doctor's office waiting room. She is a receptionist at a doctor's office. And this woman appears, and so she follows her and has the opportunity to interview her. The reason why she's a featured person in her podcast is that she was acquitted of several murders in the 60s. And she is very wealthy, and she lives in this beautiful, huge mansion, which may or may not be haunted. Yeah. It's a great read. It's so much fun. I read it so fast. Which character did you like most? Which character did you like most? That would have to be the protagonist. Her name is Shay Collins. She's a receptionist, but by night she runs a true crime website. This is so great. It's creepy, y'all. Read with caution. I loved this one so much. This is Jane in Love by Rachel Givney. The premise of this is that Jane Austen is feeling frustrated. She's just rejected what's his name, Bigwither. She doesn't know what to do with her life. She knows that she's got these expectations and the necessity to marry if she wants to have any kind of autonomy or financial stability, but she just doesn't want to marry these people. She wants to marry the love of her life. So she actually goes to London to have her fortune read. And while she's there, she receives a spell, basically, that sends her to her perfect match, who just happens to be a couple hundred years in the future. And the longer she stays and the more involved she gets, the faster her works start to disappear from the universe. And she has to make a decision: true love or her career, which is another kind of true love. What will she do? I loved this book. Let's answer a question. What motivates the actions of each of the characters in the book? Love. So there's Jane, and she does what she does for love. And there is her love interest. I won't name because I don't want to do spoilers, but there's her love interest, and he is motivated by love. Sometimes you might think that he's motivated by self-interest, but really he's motivated by love. Ultimately, he is. There is the love interest's sister. She is motivated by what she thinks is love, but is really infatuation, and that turns into a motivation of a different kind of love. And then there are some side characters who are also incredibly important to the plot, who I don't want to talk about because I don't want to ruin anything for you, but they are all very clearly motivated by love. Jane in Love. This is Pied Piper by Neville Shute. This was my second Neville Shute read ever. My first was A Town Like Alice, and I can't shut up about it. I love it so much, and now I've read this one. This is the story of an elderly man who is, during the early years of World War II, he lives in Europe. He's British. He needs a vacation, and so he tries to have a fly fishing trip in northern France, in Switzerland, kind of, and he has friends in Switzerland who work with the League of Nations, and they are not going to leave, even though things are getting really terrible and it's rumored that Paris has fallen. They're not planning on leaving. They're going to stay and do their work, but they want to evacuate their children, so they ask their friend to take them with him back to England, because as soon as all this starts to go down, he decides he needs to leave. That trip becomes much harder and more arduous than anyone ever would have imagined, and he continues to take in or take with him or enfold into the safety of their little group children all along the path who need safety, of all different kinds of nationalities and for all different purposes and reasons. And the book is just so heart-wrenchingly beautiful. I cannot recommend this book enough. It is a masterpiece. I have to answer a question about it. What changes does the main character go through? All of them. Yeah, I mean, he comes to realize he's capable of more than he ever thought he was. He loses his fear. Every time I read a Miss Marple this year, I think, oh, that's my favorite. Welcome to my favorite. And every time I read one, I'm like, oh, this is my favorite. Exhibit D. This is A Murder is Announced. So in the newspaper, there is a announcement that at a particular address at a particular time, there will be a murder. Come one, come all. Would you go? I don't know if I would go, but a lot of people do. And then suddenly the lights go out, there's a gunshot, and somebody's dead. Who? Why? How? Beyond the gun. Fascinating book, and hilarious as well. Agatha Christie just gets better and better with every Miss Marple. Everyone. But let's answer a question and hope it's not a spoiler. Something you liked about it. I liked everything about it. I really did. I really loved everything about it. I mean, just the basic premise of what I've already told you, like who thinks of a mystery like that? Who thinks of the concept of someone putting an ad in a local paper saying, hey, show up here at this time and witness a murder? Or maybe you will be the murderer, or maybe you are the murderer. Like, just the basic premise is so fresh. Everything Agatha Christie does is just so fresh. I love it. I absolutely love it. I have yet to read a Marple that does not improve upon the previous Marples, and I loved the first one, and they just keep getting better. So what did I like about it? Everything. Seance Tea Party. I read this because I pulled a middle grade tile. I had to read a middle grade, I think. Laura meets a ghostly friend, but she is growing up and she has to learn to be present in the moment with the people who are around her. So let's pull a question. Describe one significant episode. Well, quite early on, our preteen Laura, protagonist, sees the ghost and is a little bit freaked out, but not really. She's really just excited that she has a friendly ghost who wants to be her friend. Then she comes to realize very sweetly that the ghost shares the name of her childhood imaginary friend. And then she comes to realize, oh, wait, you are my childhood imaginary friend. Just so beautiful as she realizes that this ghost has been with her whole life, in one way, shape, or form. I'm not going to answer a question about this one. I've been reading Anne of Green Gables every month. I missed out 1 month, but other than that, I've been reading and rereading Anne of Green Gables. This month, I just listened to it. I didn't actually physically read it. And I think next month, this was my third read of it this year. And I think next month, I'm going to move forward to Anne of Avonlea. So that's that. If you want to know why I'm doing that, you can watch my January TBR video where I do explain why I've chosen to read Anne of Green Gables every month. Next, What the Body Remembers. I read this as my reread for this month. In December, I unwrapped a bunch of books, a bunch of gifts to myself, of books that I love, but most of which I've only read once. So how do I know if I really loved them? I read What the Body Remembers, which is a story of Roop, who is a young Sikh girl. We meet her at birth and we follow her through her life. But it is also the story of the partition of Pakistan and India. And I read this while living in northern India, very close to where this book takes place. And so I loved it when I read it, and I have carried that love with me, but I only read it once, like 20 years ago. So I wanted to reread it, and I had last year at some point acquired a used copy of it. So I pulled it off my shelf and wrapped it as a possible reread. And I picked it for the month of April. At first as I was reading, I was like, oh, this is rough. But the deeper I got into it, the more I started to realize what I had loved about it. At first, I was a little bit afraid that I'd only loved it because I was already so immersed in India that this was just an extension of my life at that time. No, I love it in its own right. It does take a commitment to get through the first, I'd say, 150-ish pages. Lots of stuff happens. It's almost like too much happens. It gets really good. And it's quite chunky. So 150 pages in the grand scheme of things may sound like a lot, but it's not actually a lot. Loved this. Let's answer a question about it. A long one. Oh, it's not long. It's just a big piece of paper. Did your opinion of this book change as you read it, and how? I just explained that. Yes. Thank you, question, for saving us some time. Yes, my opinion changed. I just told you how. This was a birthday book haul read. I also, my birthday's in December. I had collected a large number of books for my birthday over the course of probably from September to December of last year. And I wanted to make sure that for a birthday haul video in December, but I wanted to make sure that I read them this year instead of just hauling them and then not getting to them right away. So I have worked them into my TBRs over the course of the year. This is one of the ones for my birthday book haul reads that was worked into my TBR for April. This was my second E.M. Forrester read. I was very familiar with the story. I love both of the film adaptations. Don't kill me. I love them more than I loved this book. Last year I read for the first time, even though I knew the story already, I read A Room with a View and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I was so looking forward to reading Howard's End. This one just felt strangely dull and absurd a little bit. I don't know. I didn't like it. Something about it wasn't right. I know it's well beloved. I know a lot of people say it's his best. I think A Room with a View is far superior. I love the film adaptations of this. Let's answer a question. Oh, I got explain the title again. Yeah, okay. So let's explain the title. Howard's End is the name of a family house, and this family house is kind of a part of an inheritance. I don't want to say battle, but issue. Causes a lot of chaos in a lot of people's lives. It's also an idyllic spot. All right, I've got Cartographers, maybe my favorite books of the month. Cartographers by Peng Shepherd is a weird little magical realism tale of a group of map makers, and the maps that have like paper towns on them, that like things that don't really exist, but that the map maker puts there to indicate that it's their map, so that if somebody copies it, if without their permission, if somebody plagiarizes their map instead of doing their own work, they will include that imaginary place. However, in the Cartographers, there's something strange going on. Lots of flashbacks and many, many different voices telling these stories. Really, really great. Espionage, excitement, everything. So that is that. Let's answer a question. Something you disliked about it. It took me a really long time to just settle into it. The start of it was quite confusing, I think, but it got better. It definitely did. But I think that what I disliked was how much effort I had to put forward in the beginning. I really had to earn my progress in that book. I think it should have been easier. Another favorite read of the month of April is The Library of Legends by Jane Chang. And I said in my TBR video, where I put this on my TBR for the month of April, that I have multiple Jane Changs on my shelf, and I had not read her at all, and I didn't know if we were gonna mesh. But this is magical realism historical fiction. It is wonderful. It takes place during the time when Japan is invading China, and there's a group of college students that need to pretty much walk to safety, and they're also going to take with them a set of scrolls or books or texts known as the Library of Legends to keep it safe as well. It is a Civil War time, but it also is a invasion from another country time. So there's a lot of confusion about who you can trust and who you can't. And then also superimposed over all of this are these magical, mythical beings. There are things happening in the world that not everybody can see, although they are there to clearly be seen. And the book is just brilliant. It's brilliant, and I'm so happy that I finally read it. And I'm so happy that I have at least one more, maybe two, but at least one that I've found, Jane Chang, on my shelf. I have another one to look forward to. So I'm going to pull a question. The question is a little bit long. It says, would you like to live in the time period or setting of the book? I would not like to live in that time period. I did live in China and I absolutely loved it, but I wouldn't want to live in the time period of this book. It's a terrifying time period. There's a lot of, although here's one thing I would like. This is pre-Cultural Revolution, and so it's pre-communist China. And so I would really like to know what that was like. The culture and the people, and yeah, I would like to know what that's like. But also, it's a time of a lot of endings and a lot of new beginnings. There's transition happening, and it's really violent transition. And yeah, no, I would not want to live in this place and this time, but I sure appreciate reading about it. The Saturday Wife, a novel by Naomi Reagan. This is one of my favorite authors who I just discovered last year, Naomi Reagan, and this was my third book by this author. It's actually their debut novel, though, and you could tell it's a little bit different from their other novels that I've read, which were a duology, which I absolutely loved, an unorthodox match and an observant wife. Everything she writes is based in usually Orthodox, not always Orthodox, but it's based in Jewish culture. Usually, I think, always Jewish culture in the States, but I could be wrong about that. I have my fourth Naomi Reagan book on my May TBR, The Sisters Vice, and I'm excited to read that one. I enjoyed this. I did not love this, but I enjoyed it enough that I really think that I probably would have been compelled to pick up more by this author anyway. This is told a little bit, like it reminded me a little bit of the same kind of feeling as Gossip Girl. Like it feels like there's this overarching, all-knowledgeable narrator who knows the end from the beginning and knows more information than our characters do. Yeah, it is about a Jewish girl who makes some unexpected choices because she really just wants to be part of things. She wants her place. She wants her fair share of things. And they don't come easy to her. And so she thinks she has to resort to scheming and manipulation. And so she does. And it doesn't necessarily work out how she thinks it will. It's very well written. It's quite funny. It's also quite devastating. The Saturday Wife. I need to answer a question about it. Let's see. Have you read any other books by this author? How would you compare them to this selection? Saving me time again. Thank you. I've already answered that question. Yes, I've read other books. I will read more books. And this book was not as dynamic as the first two that I read by this author, but loved it all the same. The Blue Bistro by Ellen Hildebrand. I read this because it was my pick from the Jenga game that I played for that TBR of a cover that I didn't like. I really dislike this cover. I wanted to give Ellen Hildebrand another shot. I absolutely love her Winter Street Quartet. Absolutely love that set of books so much. And I hadn't read anything else by this author, and so I wanted to read another book by them. This was not great for me. I think I gave it 3 stars. I might have given it 2 stars. I did really still enjoy Ellen Hildebrand's style of writing, but this particular story annoyed me. Basically, there's a girl who is running away from an abusive relationship and a set of life choices that aren't really serving her. And she arrives in Nantucket and takes a position, or she's offered a position to work as a assistant manager, as a maitre d' type of a person for a very famous and well-established restaurant that is inexplicably closing at the end of the season. There's a lot of mystery involved in this story. What really annoyed me about this is how she allows herself to be treated. How she so very clearly does not value herself, the way that others are allowed to treat her because one particular character has an illness. It just felt really unhealthy to me, and I didn't enjoy reading it. And in the end, I didn't have the feeling that the author wanted me to have of oh, wow, wonderful, oh my goodness, everybody got everything they wanted. I felt annoyed with every character in this book. Every single one. So let's answer a question. I will read another Ellen Hildebrand because I still love the Winter Street books so much, but that particular book was not the one for me. So this is this book a meadow, a valley, a mountain, or a mesa? I think it's a valley, and this is why. It's not safe. It looks safe. It feels calm, safe, and trustworthy, but really it's dangerous in its messaging, in its unintended or unintentional messaging, that you should allow yourself to be hurt so that others can be happy. Next, I didn't read it next. Next on the stack is The Big Finish by Brooke Fossey. I love this cover so much. And the book itself was so dark. Basically, it's the story of an alcoholic and his friend who are elderly, and they live in a old folks home, and they want to stay in that particular one because it's nicer than the government-run one that they will end up in if they misbehave or do anything. It's basically a long list of chapters about the indignities of growing old. Like I said, one is a recovering alcoholic, and he has to come to terms with that again in his lifetime because the granddaughter of his roommate shows up on their doorstep or climbs through their window, brings with her a whole slew of problems, and opens up tons of cans of worms, including the alcoholism. And I think it's a fine story. I even think it was well written, but it's so dark, and it's just not what I wanted it to be. It's just not my kind of book, and many people will probably love this, but like it says that it's filled with charm and unexpected friendship by the woman who wrote Major Pettigrew's Last Stand, said that, and I find these books to be so utterly different. I just didn't like it. J. Ryan Stradall, who wrote one book I love and one book I hate, says that it was warm, funny, and tender. I didn't feel warm. Occasional funny, tender, no, never. It's harsh. It's a harsh book. So let's answer a question about it. Ooh, this question does not want to come unbent. Okay. Oh, who was your favorite character and why? I think, what's the main character? Duffy. Duffy Sinclair is the main character. Meet Duffy, an old curmudgeon who lives in an assisted living home. That's our recovering alcoholic. And he is the one through whom we hear the story told. And I like him. I do. But I wish the story had been told differently. I think we could have still told the same story without it being so harsh. I read the readers of Broken Wheel recommend. This was a birthday book haul book. This is the story of, what's her name? Sarah. Sarah is 28 and has never been outside of Sweden. And she has an elderly pen friend named Amy who lives in Broken Wheel, Iowa. And she comes to visit. She's going to stay with her for 3 or 4 weeks. But when she arrives in Broken Wheel, she learns that her pen friend has died. Amy is dead. She decides to stay anyway, and she makes friendships, and she starts a bookstore of sorts. The town has to fight all of the laws of immigration and naturalization, and there is romance, there's just all sorts of stuff that goes on in this book that I didn't know I was getting into. I really enjoyed this when it was over. I didn't enjoy the process of reading it, though. It felt choppy and weird, and I didn't ever know what the point was. I could understand the logical progression from one thing to another, but it kind of felt like an exquisite corpse. Do you know that game where you have a sheet of paper and one person draws the head, folds the paper over, and another person adds something and folds that over, and another person adds the torso and folds that over, and another person adds the hips and folds that over, and then you've drawn the whole thing and you unveil this weird entity that was group drawn together. You can do the same thing with writing lines of poetry or whatever. It's called the exquisite corpse. It's a Dada method of creation. This felt like an exquisite corpse. It felt like it was written by multiple people from multiple perspectives that didn't read the stuff that came before. Not carefully, anyway. So let's answer a question about it. By telling this particular story, what questions does the author get to ask? So immigration, found family, sense of belonging. What is a citizen? What is love? Big questions, huge questions. And again, I did enjoy this when it was over. I'm glad I read it. I think I'm better for having read it, but I didn't like reading it. And finally, East of Eden, which I will answer a question for, but I won't say much about because I'm going to be recording a whole Beans Big Book Bash wrap up or whatever, breakdown discussion of my read of this book. This was my Beans Big Book Bash pick for April. So let's pick a question. Was the author descriptive? Was he or she better at describing the concrete or the abstract? Was the author clear about what he or she was trying to say, or were you confused by some of what you read? How did this affect your reading of the book? Okay, so yes and no. I was not confused about anything in this book. Yes, Steinbeck was descriptive of both the physical and the ephemeral. There is an awful lot of imagery in this. There's a lot of allusion to biblical characters, particularly those in Genesis, particularly those in the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. This was a phenomenal reading experience, and yes, it is descriptive. That is all I will say about this. And that, my friends, is the end of the wrap-up. If you stuck around for this whole wrap-up, thank you. I appreciate it. Next month in May, it's Mary Shelley May in my world. I will be reading lots of books inspired by or written by or about Mary Shelley. I'm so tired. So tired. But we work on. I'm gonna say goodbye. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to me. I hope I made sense. And I hope that you are interested in picking up one or more of these books. I highly recommend them all, even the ones I didn't enjoy all that much. I didn't have a DNF. I didn't have a single DNF this month. It's been a long time since I haven't had a DNF. It's a good month. It's a good reading month. If you're going to read any of these, let me know. I'll see you later. Let's go read something. Bye.